we'll be continuing with a living documentation event, and first up now will be Jennek Geels. Well, let's dive into that living documentation again. Jennek has worked at Canon production printing for many years, and after visiting a talk by Matt Wine in 2012 about behavior-driven development, he made it its personal mission to get BDD adopted at Canon. But when he succeeded in doing that, a new challenge arose: how to scale behavior-driven development and living documentation. So Jennek will tell us how primary school grammar lessons came to the rescue.
Ikigai. This is Japanese for reason for being, at least for my being here today. And there's 4 elements. One element is what the world needs. And let's state that the world needs living documentation, at least for this afternoon. Documentation at scale. Now, the next thing is what I love. And I really love moderating sessions with domain experts and getting them to explain to me what their knowledge is about. And I'm using a tool for that called Domain Domino. I'm going to explain you all about it. My mission today is to bring the connection to living documentation at scale and knowledge elicitation using Domain Domino. Now, the third element of this Ikigai is what I'm paid for. And I'm happy to tell you that I am paid for developing scalable methods and tools for specifying and verifying application software behavior. So that fits in well to my road to eternal bliss. The fourth element would be, how good are you at it? Well, I leave that for you to judge. So let's see what we have. Right. I'm going to talk a bit about living documentation. I'm going to mix in Domain Domino, then some final words and recommendations. But let me give you a heads up. Scale is hard to demonstrate in just 20 minutes. I have a fully worked example, but it's not at scale. You would just drown. So I will isolate from the example that I have the elements that are my recommendations for what you can do today to be prepared for scaling up. So let's look at living documentation here. The context is Canon production printing, which used to be OC, a Canon company since 2010. And we built printers, but not a printer that would sit on your desktop. We built printers at a much larger scale. And look at the right, the topmost one is like 2 meters wide and the bottommost one is like 20 meters wide, and it would not fit in your garage. And there's 2 kinds of software involved. One is the embedded kind that makes the real-time things happen, like transporting sheets and putting ink droplets on paper. And the other kind is human-facing, facing the printer operator or the production supervisor or the maintenance technician. And there's like 200 plus people working on application software, and that's the scope for where I'm working. Right. What is the problem that we had to solve? This problem we had to solve was, well, initially it started out as a problem of testing. We had a lot of manual testing going on, relying on tested knowledge of testers. So the question was, can we automate this? But soon we found out we didn't have a testing problem. We had a specification problem because we had to resort to manual testing because the specifications were incomplete or sort of orphaned. And we really had to fix that before we could even begin to think about having a better test strategy. So let's focus on how to get the specifications on the table. Well, luckily, there is plenty of experience in that. I got word of it in 2012 in my Ruby days. And since 2018, I prefer to use the word specification by example because it has the word specification in there, which was the thing we had to tackle. These days, we also label it as living documentation, which emphasizes a different aspect of what is essentially the same set of skills and behaviors in your company. Living documentation emphasizes the fact that there's something you can refer to as a verified description of what the product does. I'm not picky about the terms. it depends on who I'm talking to, what word I might use. Today it's living documentation. Right. We're going to add something to this method that is available from the outside. But before doing that, let's be precise about what we like about specification by example and living documentation. In one word, we like that we create shared understanding by having structured conversations. That's the shortest description I could find of what we like. In other words, stop the talking, start the capturing. There's roles defined, 3 amigos, your product owner, your developer, and your tester, and they come together in the 3 amigos session. There's steps defined, discovery, formulation, and automation. And discovery is so important, and this is a method that stresses that. There's a wealth of guidance, books and trainings that you can have, and there's good reward loops. Like, it's not like you put in the effort and I get the benefits. Everybody who puts in effort gets their own benefits. That's a well-designed process. And the threshold is low. It's natural language. You don't have to go to a course for weeks or before you can start. You can just jump in, provided that there is a moderator who helps you out. And after a while, it gets a self-moderated process. The other thing we really like about it is the tooling. Those examples that you capture become tests, and they can be automated tests. So we can verify on a daily basis during each build that things are green. And if they are not, the build breaks. And if the build breaks, everybody is on deck. So this sense of urgency is very important. So failure is not an option. It's got to be green. Yet, we want to add something here. And I've been talking to the originators of Gherkin a lot, and they were sort of reluctant to add anything for good reasons, because they said when you add stuff like more concepts, you risk of shifting of having conversations where everybody is equal to struggle with the formalisms, like how should we put this? No, you should really put it like that. And having fewer concepts avoids that kind of pitfall. So I'm really very much aware of that. So if and when we add something, we must be sure to preserve the fundamental qualities. What I'm going to add today is what I call a shared domain language or a shared vocabulary or your dictionary, but not in a way that you're used to. It's not like Merriam-Webster's, like there's a keyword and there's some description. It's something different, you will see. And why are we doing this? It's because we have the need of scaling up. And the discipline of scaling up is called engineering. And engineering brings plans and organization and tools. And you're going to see a few of those. Right. Let's look at domain domino, which adheres very nicely to the stages of discovery and formulation and automation after the fact. When I learned domain domino like 20 years ago, we didn't use those words, but they fit perfectly. And this is what it is. It's a language game. We have little pieces of plastic. The red ones are the verbs. The black ones are the nouns. And there are other colors that come in gradually as you play the game. And actually, you're playing on 2 boards. Top right, you are putting your language on this example. Let's assume the story is log into an application. The rule we want to work with is credentials must be valid. And the example we are going to work on is the one where credentials are username and password, as opposed to, say, username and fingerprint, or like a social login from Facebook or GitHub. So this is the simplest of examples that we have. So this is on the table. We have done this bit of example mapping. But then when you start having the conversation, people may say very, very different things like, what does it mean to log in? Well, you log in with a username and password. But others might say, you log in using your account giving a session token. And maybe somebody says, well, the application is open for you. None of those should be dismissed. Everybody is bringing something sensible to the table. But how to make sense of this? How to moderate this process and have something constructive on the table? And the art of moderation is that you start asking questions. So people start explaining to each other. That's one thing. But the other thing is that if you would just have the conversation, say for 10 or 15 minutes, and you don't put anything on the table, I would say it's time lost. All the things, all the insights that have been exchanged sort of evaporate. So this domain domino thing is something that lets you capture every minute, every 5 minutes, something on the table. So after a while, this would be the outcome. It would be natural sentences structured using nouns and verbs and some adjectives or properties. But this is not what starts. It is not that you start from the top left and gradually work your way to the bottom right. For example, this is not how you would do a painting. When Rembrandt did the Night Watch, he didn't start top left, started painting, and 2 weeks later he was done bottom right. There are other ways that lead you to this process, and I'm going to show you how you gradually build up this understanding, this shared understanding, by first doing this. The first question I would ask is, let's look at each of the verbs that you have mentioned. And let's be precise whether we have a shared understanding of what a verb means. And we're going to make that understanding by what is, well, let's put it technically, this the signature. What direct object or indirect objects, and these are grammatical terms that you may remember from primary school, are there associated with the object? So you do that for each verb that people have used. And then you see there's some sort of connection. You can actually, when you have the blocks on the table, you can read them out like this. I would put my pen on the red thing called to authenticate. And I would say you authenticate an account giving an authentication. You may notice that the prepositions are not captured on the table. Those are easily remembered. But this is how you can constantly verbalize, read back in natural language what you have just captured as these domino blocks. Right. So there's the list of phrases that we have captured on the table. Now, the next round of questions would be, can we say something about the life cycle of each of these entities or nouns that are involved? Can we just list the actions that it participates in? And can we put a sequence to them? And can we see whether there's any repetitions? And this is very powerful. Naive as it seems, it so happens that this is the moment where you discover a lot of seemingly agreement turns into, something more is going on here. You will discover synonyms or even worse, homonyms. I remember the moment, this was in the session with Gaspar, when we were discussing the word page in the printer context. And you would be amazed how many different definitions there are of the word page when you think of printing. It may refer to your sheets, or it may refer to a PDF file, and this is a homonym, and you have to flesh this out. So there's very many more language aspects there on the bottom of the next slide. So this means that we gradually build up an understanding of what these words mean by looking at how they interconnect. And I bring this on the table by asking the question. So the only one who needs to be skilled here is the moderator. Other people can just jump in. And you might think, well, this is like kindergarten, and I've had that objection up front from many people. But all I'm asking is, let's do this for 20 minutes. And I can guarantee you, after 20 minutes, everybody is sold, ranging from developers, testers, product owners, product planners, high-profile business unit business developers. They're all hooked after 10 minutes even. All right, so this is how it all plays together. You first gradually build up your domain language, which brings you in a position to sort out all the things that have been mentioned about logging in. And then you are ready to formulate your example, which in this case would be the scenario which is on the next slide, which is not that complicated as a scenario. It doesn't tell you a lot. You already knew how logging in works. But now it's been formulated. And the property of this formulation is that it strictly adheres to the language that we have defined together, which makes the process of formulating rather easy, because while you're typing in as a dedicated person like Gaspar explained, you just keep your eye on the pictures that you made of the domino. So this could be done by discipline, and that works perfectly well. But we are taking the next step as a company. We are building an editor that does, say, like code completion and cross-checking based on this vocabulary. We are building what you might call a Gherkin, vocabulary-aware Gherkin editor, which leads us to the process of, say, 3-step formulation. First, we formulate the domain. We just type in what we had on the table. And the table, the dominoes is pretty precise. In a natural way, you get to a certain level of consistency and precision. And if not, go back. Next, you formulate your product functionality. And third, you formulate the scenarios on top of that. Scenarios that originated from example mapping, nothing wrong with that. It's just that your formulation is now interconnected with the domain language. This is the tool that we're building, and we're building it using another tool called JetBrains MPS, and MPS stands for Meta Programming System. The meta means it's a DSL for creating DSLs, or put differently, it is a workbench to create workbenches for the 3 amigos. So engineering-wise, we're doing it in 2 steps. There's this language engineer who creates a DSL for domains and functions and scenarios, so that the 3 amigos can sit down and define the vocabulary for their project, the functionality for their project, and the scenarios for their project. And we're taking this seriously. We have done the proof of concepts the past half year, and we're going into a field trial next half year. But this is something, it's an experiment. It's an experiment for us to come to grips with the scale of this. So I was thinking of this tool not being available to you. What would be my message that we have distilled from working with the domain language-based approach and the tooling? What would be something that you can use even today to be prepared for scaling up and having this structured vocabulary? And this is where it happens. When you write step definitions at some point, which is in the automation phase, you start out with nothing. You get a function body generated by your tooling, and you have to connect the language that you have been using externally, the shared domain language, which is there in the attribute and in the function method, function name. And as an automator, you have to read that sentence, interpret it, and think about, I'm supposed to do something that does what is suggested or promised here. So this is odd. Where are my slides now? I'm getting into, right. There's another slide in between. So typically, if you would find in the code that you're doing, this particular bit where it says the editor.close, I would be confident that the code that has been provided here would do what is promised. I'm actually connecting an internal domain language made out of APIs and properly chosen variable names to the outside world. And it makes sense to have this connection really tight, because otherwise there would be still 2 languages and you would have to go back and forth all the time. But this seems so obvious. but it has to be trained, because this is what happened in our code base. When I went through it, I go through that several times to find out automation guidance, and you would find things like it doesn't say editor close, it says editor status save. Now this makes me think, is save the same thing as close? Who knows? And why does it say status while we're not dealing with status, we're dealing with the editor as a whole? So this makes me think. And we had to educate the people designing the API to say, we have this lovely vocabulary created during the 3 Amiga sessions. Why are you creating something from scratch that seems to be different? So this was fixed. It is now the editor.close. But alignment between the internal language and the other language goes 2 ways. This is an example from our code base that we are not proud of, but this is real life. It shows that the internal code is okay, but this automator, this person writing this method, figured out that there were like 5 ways of stating the same thing. And when I came across it, I asked the person who did this, like, why are you doing this? And he said, well, these scenarios are like sacred. They have been discussed and they have been approved, etc. And I dare not touch them. I said, well, you better give feedback on this, because you are spotting something about inconsistencies in our language that will hurt us. So you have to educate your people to push backwards to make those languages aligned. Right. Well, there's a lot more to say about step definitions and doing your automation. This is not the place, giving time. So, but there's a lot of code in your tests that you can actually bring in the unit tests thing. It's a different story, different presentation. Final words. Why you like the mix? We like blending Domino with living documentation and specification by example, because it uses the same roles, same steps, the same reward mechanism, the same low threshold giving natural language. Okay, the guidance is somewhat complementary because you capture more of the conversation. And it fulfills the central adagium, stop the talking, start the capturing, which in Dutch would be niet lullen maar leggen. But that doesn't translate very well. But that's how this method is known internally, the niet lullen maar leggen method. And there's tools. The tools for discovery make a great mix. The tools for formulation and automation is something to be explored. Extracting a vocabulary, I know there are experiments going on and other tooling. This is something that is worth looking into. But you can even, without having those tools, you can do something sensible from the perspective that you are actually building a language and applying it while writing scenarios. Taking that perspective, well, first of all, keep having conversations. No tool, no method should get in the way of getting those conversations. Keep finding those rules and example. That is the most important thing to treasure. But once you are at it, be sure to begin to capture the language proper to keep it aligned with your API language. This will be a very important precondition to scaling up later. And that's it. That's what I have to say on living documentation at scale.
Thank you, Jennek, for sharing this with us. Well, interesting talk, a lot about language, domain language, shared domain language. Well, it reminded me of the term ubiquitous language made popular by Eric Evans in his book, Domain Driven Design. Are these languages the same thing, or?
They are very similar in what they are after. They are both after establishing a shared vocabulary so that people get a better understanding of what they mean. But there's a difference. Eric Evans starts very much from the object orientation way of thinking. So there's objects, and objects may have methods. And this leads to the, I would say, artifact that verbs are like second-class citizens. He actually acknowledged this in his book. Whereas the way we approach it, actions and verbs, I should say, verbs are first-class citizens, and this is only natural. We're trying to describe behavior. Now, try to describe behavior to me and not use any verbs. So verbs must be at the center, and that's what we do with the red blocks and do all sorts of things with those. So they serve the same purpose, and when you come to the mapping, which happens when you do the step definitions, you have to map object orientation technology. I'm assuming you work in C# and not say F#. You have to map that. The mapping is not too complicated, but it's a different emphasis altogether.
Thank you. And you talked about the domino game you're playing. Well, it looks a bit like event storming or different other games I've seen. It's used to create a shared understanding, to create a common language. What made you decide to use domino as a tool instead of just capturing a tool or a drawing tool, or use something else?
You have to be there to see what it does to people. I told you they're like holding back because are we in kindergarten? I'm a grown-up. But the moment you ask them questions and ask them, like, if they are in a discussion among themselves, I would ask them, please put these and these blocks on the table to capture your standpoint. And I would ask the other person to do that. And they would do that. And they would sort of start playing together and putting the things together and find a compromise by shifting those blocks. It's a very physical experience in a way. And if you would do that, say, in a tool, you would say have a Visio template, and you would have collaborative editing. It's not that direct. Somebody's holding the mouse. Can I take over? The negotiation of arriving at a shared understanding is so much more direct and has so much more. Once you're there, you really own. Everybody owns the shared understanding that has been reached after you've done it physically. So it's a whole different dimension. So I stick by doing domino, and okay, I have this virtual tool for the past year, but that's only limited.
Okay, and are you the only company doing the domino games? Ask someone.
It used to be world famous in Veghel in the 1990s. There were like 10 or maybe 15 companies back then who did this, and there were like 50 people at that company. But it turned out to be very difficult to turn these insights of working method into a business model. So after, say, 8 years or 10 years, this company went bankrupt because there was no business model behind it. Because they're basically challenging the invoice by the hour approach of many companies. So there's only few people left. I traced them. We have a group of people who chat about this. And it is my mission in life, as I said in my Ikigai, to preserve this and make sure that others are being trained as operators. So we keep long logs of our insights and guidance. So we have a document of, say, 15 pages with the steps and guidance that you go through during the session. So it is something we want to be transferable.
Oh, that some people are already asking for me. This sounds interesting. Maybe I would like to do this as well. Is there anything they can read about this? A blog post, getting started guide, or anything?
Well, the only publication that's out there is the book from, say, 20 years ago, which is very much about the underlying model and the notation. The actual practice of moderation is something that has never been documented properly. And we are about to do that. But only after it has been sort of, the document that we have has been internally validated, that it makes sense. So it will be there. Don't hold your breath, but be assured it's my So before I retire, you will have the blog and the books and all that. And meanwhile, contact me because I'm talking validation here, and I may have all sorts of bold claims like this works for everybody. Maybe it does not. Every method has its limitations. So I'd be willing to step in and sort of debug certain cases of why don't we get this behavior driven out into examples. I'd be happy to look at that.
Thank you, Jennek, for this talk, for telling us about the domino game and scaling living documentation.